Imagine reaching a moment when you realize you can't keep pretending. The masks you've worn for decades feel suffocating. The games people play appear shallow, and the life you've built suddenly resembles a prison constructed from other people's expectations. This isn't depression. This is awakening. And with that awakening comes a slow, almost involuntary shedding of everything that isn't truly you. Carl Jung devoted his life to documenting this inner transformation. Through his work with thousands of individuals, he noticed a profound pattern. Authentic spiritual growth rarely arrives with dramatic announcements or sudden leaps. Instead, it unfolds gradually, through release. A gentle but powerful letting go of old behaviors, identities, and survival strategies that once felt necessary but now feel unbearable. According to Jung, when a person begins to awaken, they don't force themselves to quit certain habits. Instead, the soul begins to reject them, almost like an allergic reaction to inauthenticity. What once seemed normal suddenly feels intolerable. You don't wake up one day and consciously decide to let these things go. You simply notice that you can no longer participate. Your spirit has outgrown the performance. One of the first things highly spiritual people naturally begin to quit is the desperate hunger for approval. It's not a choice, but a shift in the very structure of the psyche. Seeking approval begins to feel physically uncomfortable, as if your system can no longer digest it. Jung compared it to developing an intolerance. Something you once consumed freely now makes you sick. He observed this countless times. A woman who once lived entirely for her mother's validation suddenly found herself unable to play that role anymore. Her hands shook when she tried. A man who thrived on professional recognition felt nauseous at the thought of competing for praise. These weren't acts of rebellion, they were signs of evolution. What's happening here is the emergence of what Jung called the self, your authentic core beyond ego. This deeper self doesn't need validation because it is already whole. It's like a tree that has discovered a hidden spring. It no longer depends on rain to survive. But this transition isn't smooth. At first, you find yourself caught between two worlds. You stop chasing likes but still check for them. You no longer beg for compliments but still notice when they're absent. This process unfolds in layers: approval from strangers, then acquaintances, then friends, and finally, the hardest, from family. Each release brings grief as well as freedom, because you're not just quitting behaviors, you're shedding an identity. Yet, as the hunger for approval dies, something extraordinary takes its place. An inner sense of worth that no one can grant or take away. Not confidence, which still references others, but a grounded worth that arises from within. This is why spiritually awake people often carry a quiet, unshakable presence. They've stopped playing the exhausting game of proving themselves. Instead, they live by what Jung described as inner authority, a compass that points true regardless of external judgment. And the next thing they slowly quit, the need to be special. Jung discovered a fascinating paradox within spiritual growth. As people awaken, they become more unique, yet they care less about being special. They grow into their authentic selves, but with less need for recognition. They become extraordinary not by trying to stand out, but by quietly letting go of the need to be seen as extraordinary. In the early stages of awakening, many experience what Jung called spiritual inflation. After a powerful breakthrough or mystical encounter, there's often a surge of superiority, the belief that you've seen truths hidden from others, touched realms others can't access, or gained wisdom beyond the ordinary. For a while, this feels like a badge of honor. You might subtly share stories of synchronicities, meditations, or spiritual downloads. Not as blatant bragging, but as a way of separating yourself from the unawakened. But then, something begins to shift. Jung noticed this shift in every person who matured spiritually. The very need to be special starts to feel heavy, artificial. Like wearing a costume that once felt like wings, but now weighs you down. He described a patient who had built his entire identity around being the spiritual one. He was the go-to sage among friends, the deepest thinker in every room, the one who meditated longer and knew more. One day, while mid-sentence explaining a lofty concept, he suddenly saw himself from the outside. He later told Jung, I looked absurd. I wasn't being spiritual. I was just using spirituality as a way to feel special. That recognition marks the beginning of the slow quit. You start catching yourself before dropping hints about your spiritual progress. You notice when you're about to share for the dopamine hit of being different. Each time you see it, the act becomes harder to sustain. The quitting happens gradually. You stop volunteering your practices unless asked. You lose interest in comparing levels of awakening. You let go of needing anyone to acknowledge your higher consciousness. One woman told Jung, "I used to need everyone to know I was deeper, wiser, more conscious. Now I'm content being invisible." Being special was a prison. Being nobody is freedom. And here's the irony Jung found profound. When people stop trying to be special, they become truly unique. Not artificially unique, but authentically themselves. When you're no longer performing your uniqueness, your true individuality shines through naturally. He called this individuation without inflation. The process of becoming fully yourself without needing an audience. It's like a flower blooming. The flower doesn't bloom to be admired. It blooms because blooming is its nature. Whether someone is watching or not doesn't matter. This terrifies the ego, which thrives on specialness. If I'm not special, it asks, then what am I? The answer is disarming in its simplicity: you're you, and that's enough. And when this truth settles in, another illusion begins to dissolve, the performance of happiness. Because awakening doesn't mean smiling all the time. It means being real all the time. She tried to return to work wearing her polished spiritual mask, the role of the wise, untouchable healer. But her body refused. Sitting with clients, she attempted to hold the calm persona she had always carried, and instead, tears began to stream down her face. Later she confessed to Jung, "I thought being spiritual meant rising above human pain. Now I understand. It means embracing it. I can't be the enlightened one anymore. I can only be the real one." This moment captures the essence of awakening, the slow release of performances that no longer fit. If you recognize yourself in this, know you're not alone. Millions of souls across the world are going through the same unraveling, quietly letting go of roles, masks, and beliefs that once felt essential but now feel unbearable. And before we continue, remember, this journey is easier when shared. Subscribe to Unseen Psyche and join our growing community of seekers, courageously shedding the false to embrace the true. Share in the comments what you've found yourself slowly quitting. Your story may be the exact medicine another awakening soul needs today. Now let's continue. Because the fourth thing spiritually awake people slowly quit is perhaps the most destabilizing of all: the need for certainty. Jung noticed that spiritual growth doesn't lead to more answers. It leads to comfort with questions. It doesn't lead to more certainty. It opens into mystery. It doesn't end in knowing. It flowers into wonder. The human mind, however, clings to certainty as if it were oxygen. I know who I am. I know what's true. I know how life works. I know what happens after death. I know my purpose. These declarations feel safe, but Jung observed that they are actually prisons. Awakening shatters these walls, not by disproving them, but by revealing that the craving for certainty itself is the barrier to truth. One of Jung's most brilliant patients, a physicist, experienced this collapse. He told Jung, "I used to know how the universe worked. Now, I don't even know how my coffee cup works. The more conscious I become, the less certain I am about anything." To an outsider, it might sound like confusion. But Jung recognized it as clarity, the clarity of mystery. The process was painful. His mind tried desperately to rebuild certainty, replacing scientific facts with spiritual ones. But every time he clung to a conclusion, it dissolved. Slowly, he quit the need for solid ground. First, he released the need to know how things work. Then, why things happen. Finally, he let go of even knowing who he really was. Jung called this entry into the cloud of unknowing, a state where not knowing holds more truth than knowing ever could. This unfolds in stages. First, you quit certainty about the world outside you, then about others, then about your own story. Finally, even about your identity. Each step feels like death to the ego, the death of the know, it all mind. But what's born in its place is liberation. People who quit certainty develop a profound ability. They can hold paradox. They can act without being sure, commit without demanding guarantees, believe without clinging. This isn't confusion, it's maturity. The recognition that truth is alive, too vast to be caged by concepts. And as certainty dissolves, another layer of ego begins to fall away. The fifth thing spiritually awake people quit is one of the hardest: the habit of blame. The quitting of blame is slow and often agonizing because blame provides so many psychological comforts. It explains our suffering. It protects our innocence. It gives us an identity to cling to. It even creates bonds with others who share similar wounds. To let go of blame can feel like letting go of the story that has defined us. Jung once worked with a woman carrying layers of legitimate grievances, an abusive childhood, betrayal by her husband, discrimination at work. Her pain was real and her anger entirely justified. Yet Jung noticed something deeper. Her attachment to blame was suffocating her. It kept her locked in the role of the wronged one, unable to step into her own power. Through years of inner work, he watched her begin to loosen that grip. She didn't do it by denying the harm done to her, nor by forcing premature forgiveness. Instead, she began noticing her own unconscious participation in repeating patterns. She saw how she gravitated toward partners who would betray her, jobs that mirrored rejection, and circumstances that reinforced her identity as a victim. Eventually, she told Jung, "The day I stopped blaming was the day I became free. Not because others weren't wrong, they were, but because I finally realized holding on to blame was my choice. Their wrongness was real, but my bondage to it was self-imposed." This realization shakes the ego to its core. To quit blame means taking responsibility for wounds that were never your fault. It requires admitting that, on some level, your soul participated in choosing the very experiences you resented most. It means recognizing that pain, while brutal, was also purposeful. Jung mapped out the stages of quitting blame. First, rage at the injustice. This shouldn't have happened. Second, awareness of repetition. Why does this keep happening? Third, the startling insight of unconscious participation. I somehow play a role in this pattern. Fourth, radical responsibility. I am the author of my experience. And finally, transcendence. Leaving behind the victim-perpetrator dynamic altogether and seeing life as a vast web of awakening, where every role serves a higher unfolding. A man who had spent decades resenting his father walked this path. He confessed, "I made my father into a monster so I wouldn't have to face my own shadow." The day I quit blaming him, I finally saw him clearly, not as a villain, but as a wounded human doing his best. And I saw myself too, not a victim, but a soul who chose this father for my own evolution. This does not mean excusing abuse or staying in toxic environments. It means reclaiming the power you once handed over by blaming. People who quit blame don't become weak, they become strong. They stop letting others define their story and begin living from their own authority. And as blame dissolves, another subtle illusion comes into focus. The sixth thing highly spiritual people slowly quit is spiritual bypassing, the use of spiritual ideas or practices to escape the raw reality of being human. Now I realize it's not about escaping life, it's about fully entering it. For years, I tried to transcend my humanity, to dissolve into nothingness, to become nobody. But awakening doesn't erase our human experience, it deepens it. Spiritual maturity isn't about rejecting your personality, your wounds, or your desires. It's about embodying them consciously. It's about becoming this somebody, with this unique life, these particular struggles, and these irreplaceable gifts. This is what quitting spiritual bypassing looks like. It's admitting you have preferences, even while practicing acceptance. It's allowing yourself to feel anger, even when you understand that others are doing their best. It's craving intimacy, even while knowing we are already one. It's setting boundaries, even while seeing all beings as expressions of the same self. It's trembling in fear, even while trusting the universe. Jung called this integration spiritual maturity, the ability to be fully human and fully spiritual at once. Not using spirituality to escape your humanity, and not using your humanity to reject the spiritual, but living in the sacred meeting point where heaven touches earth. And then comes perhaps the most surprising thing: highly spiritual people slowly quit the isolation of awakening. Many seekers fall into the belief that higher consciousness leads to loneliness. That awakening means walking the path alone, cut off from the rest of humanity. Jung noticed that while solitude is often essential in the early stages, it is not the destination. The deeper you grow, the more you are led back into connection, but of an entirely different quality. At first, awakening feels isolating. You're seeing illusions others still cling to. You're feeling depths others can't yet touch. You're carrying knowledge others don't seem ready for. How could you possibly relate? This sense of separation easily morphs into quiet superiority, the identity of being the awakened one among the sleeping. But those who keep walking the path eventually release this subtle pride. They realize isolation is not enlightenment, it's protection. It shields us from intimacy, from being seen in our raw humanity, from showing the messy, imperfect parts of ourselves. One woman told Jung after years of spiritual solitude, "I thought I was alone because no one matched my level of consciousness. But I was really alone because I was afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of being ordinary, afraid of being loved in my imperfection. My isolation wasn't spiritual, it was pride." When she quit this isolation, everything shifted. She found she could connect with anyone, not by lowering her consciousness, but by embracing her humanity. She could sit with unconscious people without judgment because she remembered her own unconsciousness. She could love the asleep because she recognized she, too, had once been asleep. Jung described this as the birth of conscious relationship, connection without merging, love without possession, intimacy without losing oneself, truth without preaching, the ability to stand together in aloneness. And so, as seekers quit approval, specialness, performance, certainty, blame, bypassing, and isolation, something extraordinary emerges. Conscious community. Souls who no longer meet through masks or illusions, but through authenticity. This is the great paradox Jung wanted us to understand. Quitting is not loss. It is liberation. Each release makes space for something more real, more alive, more you. To quit is to come home.